is Market Makers with Eric Schatzker and Stephanie Rule.
Welcome back to Market Makers. I'm Eric Schatzker. What impact do fertility and immigration have on economic growth? The U.S. birth rate is at historic lows, but immigration reform may finally be here. With us to talk about it, here in New York City, Jonathan Last, a writer for the Weekly Standard and author of the book, What to Expect When You're Not Expecting. And from Washington, Darrell West, Director of Government Studies at the Brookings Institution. Darrell, why don't we begin with you? How important are these issues to the debate over economic growth? We're used to talking about things like taxes and job creation incentives and things of that nature, monetary policy. Where do immigration and fertility fit in?
Actually, both immigration and fertility and demographics in general fit in very directly. We see a very dramatic case in Japan, a country that experiences very low growth, has not allowed immigrants in, and the country has been devastated economically for 2 decades now. So we really need to understand the value that immigration has for the overall economy and the role that these changing demographics play.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned Japan. Now, the truth is, if you think back to the 1980s when Japan was really at its economic height, it's at the height of its powers, demographers in Japan were warning the government, warning policymakers that it wasn't sustainable because of their demographic profile. And that's exactly what happened. 6 years later, they slammed into what they thought was a lost decade. And it turns out it was a prolonged demographic slump that they are still in today.
Are you making the case, though, Jonathan, that what we're looking at here in America isn't all that different from what Japan has experienced over the past 25 years?
Well, it's different because of immigration, and Darrell will tell you this, too. We've gotten 38 million immigrants over the last 30 years, and that's created all sorts of political problems. And, the truth is I'm a squish. I think both sides of the immigration debate have valid concerns. But from a demographic perspective, without our immigrant population, we would look like Europe.
We put up a chart earlier, and I think I'd like to bring it back if we can, that shows America's declining fertility rate for those who haven't seen it. Again, we're talking about what happens here without immigration, and people aren't having enough kids to meet the replacement rate. Darrell, if you would, why is it so significant when a country finally falls below this line where we're not actually replacing our population, again, excluding immigration?
Because population growth is very much linked to overall economic prosperity, and it's certainly the case in terms of immigration. Like, they contribute greatly to our economy, both at the high skill as well as the low skill levels. For example, half of the Silicon Valley companies had an immigrant founder or co-founder. So a lot of people don't appreciate the role that immigrants have played in overall innovation and the way in which they've contributed to our national economy.
That's true. And one of the things that's worrisome, of course, is that we are unlikely to see this immigration wave that we've had over the last 30 years continue. Because you look at the fertility rates in Central and South America, there are even steeper rates of decline than what we've seen here. Within a generation, almost every country south of our border will also be below the replacement rate. And countries that are below the replacement rate do not historically send immigrants out into the world.
But the wave of Hispanic immigrants, okay, the countries are very close, right? America, Mexico, the rest of Central and South America, connected for the most part by land. What about Africa, though? I mean, this is not 50 years ago. People can come. Africa still has very high rates of fertility, right?
Only some countries. 97% of the world's population lives in a country where the fertility rate is falling. That's a really stunning statistic. It is a global phenomenon. There are some countries in Africa, like Nigeria. Nigeria still has sustained high fertility. But they're an outlier, and you don't see that around the world. This is a global phenomenon of fertility decline.
So let's just talk about America. Let's forget about the rest of the world for just a second. What do we do about it? We are trying to reform immigration law, which in theory, for a period of time, ought to bring more immigrants into the country. Do we need to do more?
I think so, yeah. And the key is you want to bridge the gap between what we see in ideal fertility and actual fertility. Ideally, you ask Americans, and they tell you, and have for the last 40 years, they prefer to have 2.5 kids on average. Our actual fertility is 1.9, so there's a big gap there.
I've got 2.3.
Well, there you go. A third of a kid is the best kind of kid to have. And so what we really want to do is we want to think about policies and think about changes which can bridge that gap and help people achieve the fertility. I suggest reforming college. The college system seems to be broken. Costs have escalated 1,000% in real dollars since 1965.
So the cost of education is a disincentive to having more kids.
A huge, not only disincentive to have more kids, but from worrying about the cost on the kid end, but it's a disincentive for having kids on your own end because you carry around student debt for 30 or 40 years afterwards.
Darrell, is Jonathan right? Should we be doing things from a policy standpoint that would encourage Americans to have more kids?
Well, we certainly need pro-family policies, and boosting our population level is very much linked to restoring our economy. So we certainly need to do the types of things that Jonathan has proposed. I also think immigration reform is absolutely crucial, just because immigrants are very dynamic, they're hardworking, they often do the types of jobs many Americans do not want to do, and so kind of getting that policy right and fixing what is now an incredibly broken system is really vital for our future economy.
Isn't it better, Jonathan, to Daryl's point, to focus in the immediate future on immigration? Because if you do it right, the people who are going to come to America are going to bring, in some cases, money, in some cases, skills, in other cases, high levels of education, and be able to contribute immediately. Whereas if we're just focusing on the statistic of fertility, not every kid born to American parents is going to end up making a huge contribution to the economy.
Well, it doesn't have to be an either-or situation, right? We can do both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. Daryl mentioned immigrants doing the jobs Americans won't do. One of the stunning facts I found in the book is that at the most basic level, which is repopulating, that's what immigrants have done. We have an average of 4 million births a year in America. And so you look at our immigration over the last 3 decades, and that is the equivalent of basically 13 years of worth of the children that Americans weren't willing to have.
Amazing. Jonathan, thank you for joining us. Very nice to see you here. Jonathan Last of the Weekly Standard, author of the book, What to Expect When You're Not Expecting, and Daryl West of the Brookings Institution with us from D.C. Daryl, thanks very much. Nice to see you as well. Steph?
All right, well, coming up next...